Well, thank you, Alison, for that lovely introduction, those kind words. As you said, I want to do two things. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the aims of the book, setting out what it's trying to do. And then secondly, I'm going to draw from one of the chapters in particular, and that chapter focuses on humans who have thought about their relationship with the rest of nature over time. You'll be aware that that's a huge topic, and my aim in doing that has been to think about how these ideas can be introduced in classrooms. And I'd welcome your thoughts about that. So the book is going to be published, as I say, should be later this year, and it's going to join these other two titles in the Knowledge and the Curriculum series published by UCL. And the really good news is that it's going to be an open access text, so people will be able to access it very readily. So to begin with, I want to talk about the title and as a way of really saying a little bit about the aims of the book. So in 2019, the term climate emergency became the Oxford Dictionary's word or phrase of the year. It expressed an urgency and need for action, which earlier terms such as global warming had failed to achieve. I thought about using the term climate emergency in the title, but in the end, I've changed it to climate crisis. I thought this was slightly less hard-hitting and therefore more appropriate. The book aims to talk to teachers, and I wasn't sure that emergency was the most appropriate word for the classroom. In the text of the book, however, I use crisis and emergency pretty interchangeably. While there may be an urgency to act now, the book also argues that history has a key role to play and one that has been largely neglected thus far. I suggest that by looking at the historical hinterland of the current crisis, it offers us a prospect of better understanding the current crisis, and indeed such understanding may help us to forge a different future. The roots of the climate crisis take us back to a consideration of the impacts of the interactions between nature and culture. Environment, therefore, as a sometimes overlooked agent in history, is included in the title of the book. By including environmental history, my intention is not to add another scholarly specialism to the already crowded school curriculum. Rather, the current climate emergency, along with the associated crisis of biodiversity, demands that considerations of environment must become central for all of us. The foregrounding of environment is a necessary focus for all students, and that's a provocation which I develop in the book. Furthermore, it leads to a critique of current academic and professional practice, which I argue can result in strengthening the disciplinary history that we offer to students in schools. You will be aware that there are many people who will argue that we need to move away from our subject silos and take more interdisciplinary approaches in order to educate children about the current crises. I don't really disagree with that. However, this is not the situation in England, where the school curriculum is organised through separate subjects. And I want to start a conversation which recognises where we are currently today. The book, therefore, is written with a strong subject-bound curriculum in mind. It asks the question of what contribution history can make. My hope is that this will make small adaptations and innovations in classroom practice more possible and achievable for busy teachers. Although my starting point was schools in England, the work is relevant to history teaching elsewhere too. Just as the environmental crisis has no national boundaries, neither does education's response to it. Finally, by way of introduction, the book sets out to be something of a hybrid. It's an academic text to the extent that it introduces and develops a critique into history education discourse, and several chapters consider issues such as the disciplinary and pedagogical implications of including environmental history in the classroom. The book also aims to be a practical and professional text which speaks to classroom teachers. It aims to build substantive subject knowledge in areas where teachers are likely to have little knowledge, that is, relevant to environmental history in the classroom. It also aims to provide relevant resources and stimuli which can be used in classrooms, as well as sketching out some practical strategies. So the book makes the case for the inclusion of environmental history, and I want to illustrate this with two events which happened in 2020 in the city where I live, in Bristol. In June 2020, Colston's statue was toppled. In February of the same year, Greta Thunberg visited Bristol and joined the youth climate strike. She came to Bristol because the city has something of a reputation for being green. These two events both have a historical hinterland which warrants exploration in the classroom. As you will know, the toppling of Colston, along with the broader Black Lives Matter protests, has spurred on the development of decolonising initiatives in the curriculum. Similarly, I suggest that the climate crisis needs to spur us on to teach history, which includes environmental perspectives. I see this as part of an ongoing agenda of revision in history education. When it comes to environmental history, I suggest we need to ensure more porous boundaries between human and other than human in the history we teach. Or, to put it another way, I believe that we need a curriculum where the other than human players, the climate, the land, plants and animals, are more than just the passive backdrop to the activities of humans. The book aims to start a conversation about how we can do that. So that gives you a flavour of the aims of what it is the book is trying to do. What I want to do now is to focus in on one element, and that element is scale. All history moves between scales. We can start with the big picture and find small illustrative stories, or we can start with the small stories and locate them into a larger context. The book uses both approaches. One chapter, for example, starts at the smallest of scales and looks at the role that microbes have played in history. What I want to focus on here, however, involves starting big. Understanding the history of climate change and its relationship to humans necessitates an awareness of change over very large sweeps of time. Dennis Schmelt, amongst others, suggests one way we can teach history at the very large scale is to start with synoptic overviews. These need to be taught over a short time span of about an hour, about the length of a lesson. It's important to remember the status of these synoptic overviews. They should be thought of only as starter frameworks. They're nothing more than provisional factual scaffolds, which can be revisited, critiqued, and revised as students acquire more knowledge. Here's an example of a synoptic framework used in classrooms by Peter, who I think is with us today. I think this group may have discussed this in a previous session. In addressing the inquiry question, when did humans take over the world, he starts the unit of work by identifying 4 thresholds or turning points. This starter framework can be taught over the course of one lesson. It's also interesting to note some of the new language introduced: Homo sapiens, species, great acceleration. It's a reminder that including environmental perspectives will give rise to the need for different vocabulary being included in the curriculum. So here's another inquiry. This one asking, how do we survive? And I'm talking about over the whole of human history. What are the key turning points or thresholds in this synoptic framework? Schmelz suggests there are 4 thresholds. We've moved from foraging to farming to industrial work to service work. And in this graph, I've shown a simplified summary of climate change, and we could map Schmelz's 4 modes of survival onto the graph. But note the difference. Natural climate cycles enabled the development of agriculture. In contrast, industrialization and the burning of fossil fuels resulted in human-caused warming. Here's another inquiry which could be used in classrooms. What do we think about nature or think about the rest of nature? And can we tell this story as a synoptic overview with images? And that's what I want to try and do now, to look at some of these images, which I think we could use in classrooms. And let's see what they suggest about what we think about nature or how humans' relationship with the rest of nature. So this Willendorf figurine was found in Austria in 1908. It's 25,000 years old and is associated with hunter-gathering communities. Most of these figures have been found, many of these figures have been found, and most of them are rather like this, with small heads, exaggerated abdomen, breasts, hips, buttocks, and thighs. There have been different interpretations, including speculations that they may have held religious significance, that they expressed health and fertility, or they represented Mother Earth. They suggest that humans may have thought of themselves as being a part of nature. This fresco is from ancient Egypt, 5th century BCE. The image shows the wide range of roles which agriculture involves: threshing, winnowing, ploughing by hand and with animals, sowing, harvesting, axing trees, overseeing. Agriculture meant the active management of water, storage of food, and protection against pests. This can be thought of as taking control of nature and an increasing differentiation between what was thought of as home and what was considered wild. These 2 images depict the scale of nature and the great chain of being. They suggest similar ideas about how humans have thought about the rest of nature. At the bottom of the scale, there are inanimate minerals rising through fossils to plants, animals, humans, celestial beings, and God up at the top. The staircase suggests the possibility of progress, and humans are closer to God than the rest of nature. The image of the chain of being also shows hell at the bottom of the engraving, with Satan ruling over the realms of the fallen sinners. It was used by the friars who arrived in Mexico in 1521 in order to convert the indigenous populations. Darwin's Origin of Species disrupted these orderly worldviews. Although Darwin avoided tackling the controversial subject of human evolution, the implications of natural selection as the main agent of change were clear. Man was subject to the same forces as everything else in the natural world. It's for this reason that I identify Darwin as a key turning point in understanding humanity's interaction with the rest of nature. Darwin's ideas present a challenge to human exceptionalism. Linley Sambourne's cartoon ridicules Darwin's theory by depicting the worm's evolution into an English gentleman. We know that Darwin's ideas were interpreted in social Darwinian ways, with ideologies of racialized hierarchies, which had been so dangerous. On the other hand, and closer to Darwin's intentions, the cartoon suggests that humans are subject to the same processes as the rest of nature. This is NASA's black marble image of 2012, and it's a composite image which shows the planet lit up at night. Many of these lights are the result of burning fossil fuels, which has led some to describe the age we currently live in as the Carbocene, the age of coal and oil, or the Capitalocene. It suggests that humanity has taken full control of nature. On the other hand, the difference between the wealthy global north is also evident in contrast to the darkness of the global south, pointing to the gross inequalities that exist across the globe today. So in summary, using these 6 images as a synoptic framework, I suggest we can help students to understand how the development of agriculture led to changes in how humans thought about the rest of nature. This led to the exploitation of nature with justifications that humans were superior. This has continued into the present moment, although Darwin's ideas have challenged human exceptionalism. So, having established a synoptic overview of what humans have thought about the rest of nature, I now want to shift scales. We know that if history is taught only at the large scale, it can become a bit dry and lifeless. A focus on the human scale, the stories of individuals and the events they created and participated in, are some of the most engaging and popular aspects of studying history for many students. Bringing the people in the past to life is an important element of history teaching, which offers a justice of sorts to those who lived in the past. So now I want to look at 2 small-scale events which exemplify the synoptic overview I've presented. There are plenty of examples which could be used, and the 2 I've chosen both focus on individuals. They're also both examples of what we might think of as utopias. One illustrates the exploitation of nature, the other illustrates attempts to live more sustainably with nature. Both examples were short-lived and both failed. So first of all, Fordlandia. Henry Ford, the successful industrialist, set out to create a model industrial society in the heart of the Brazilian rainforest. Ford was successful in sourcing the raw materials needed for every stage of production. Latex from the rubber trees was used in the production of tyres and was the last remaining element which he wanted to bring into his industrial complex. Fordlandia was a prefabricated town. Everything that was needed to construct the place was brought in from the States, along with foods which Americans were used to eating. His vision was to create a town which looked exactly like the one in the Midwest. Things quickly went badly wrong. The housing was unsuitable. Steel roofs and asbestos insulation meant houses were too hot, and the benefits of traditional thatch raised off the ground for good ventilation had been ignored. The rubber trees were planted too close together to each other. This created an ideal breeding ground for pests. And when they tried to eradicate the pests, they ended up killing the sapling trees. The 9-to-5 working day that Ford expected was very different to local practices of working early and late with a break in the middle of the day when temperatures were high. In 1930, the local workers revolted. They set fire to the machine shop, destroyed vehicles and time clocks, looted, cut the telegraph wires, and chased the plantation managers and town's cook into the jungle until the Brazilian army arrived and suppressed the revolt. Fordlandia was abandoned in 1934, and Ford's utopian American dream had failed. It did, however, inspire this book, Brave New World by Huxley. So here's a different example On Sunday, the 1st of April, 1649, a small group of women and men started digging and sowing vegetables on the wasteland of St George's Common near London. Their leader was Gerard Winstanley, and he declared that their actions were making the earth a common treasury for all, both rich and poor, that everyone that is born in the land may be fed by the earth, his mother, that brought him forth. Many of the group came from poor families who had suffered from enclosure and had no land of their own. The winter of 1648-9 had been particularly bad, and there were reports of famine. The action of Winstanley and his group attracted attention. Others joined them on St George's Hill, and new groups were set up in 8 other counties. The movement became known as the Diggers. Unsurprisingly, local landowners objected. Gangs harassed the diggers and burnt down one of their communal houses. The diggers were taken to court, where they weren't allowed to speak in their own defence. They abandoned St George's Hill in August 1649. They had been there just 4 months. As with Fordlandia, the utopian experiment had failed. That might have been the end to it. Winstanley wasn't particularly well known in his own lifetime, but he was rediscovered by German and Russian Marxists at the end of the 19th century. Since then, his rediscovery has grown. In 1918, in celebration of the revolution, Lenin ordered that the inscription on the obelisk in Alexander Gardens, Moscow, be changed. The names of the Tsars were erased, and 19 leading revolutionary thinkers were inscribed in their place. As expected, Marx and Engels were included, and 8th on the list was Gerard Winstanley. On the 350th anniversary of the start of the Diggers experiment, supporters of the organisation The Land is Ours set up camp on St George's Hill and stayed there for 12 days. The Labour politician Michael Foot visited the camp. Since 2011, Wigan has hosted an annual festival to celebrate Wigan-born Winstanley and the Diggers movement. Winstanley has been hailed as a pioneer in both the guerrilla gardening movement and in the allotment movement. The New Statesman has compared the environmental writer and activist George Monbiot to Winstanley. The ongoing interest and changing interpretations of the English diggers through to today, then, suggests a persistent desire or reimagining of humans to retrieve a closer connection in their relationship to the land. As for St George's Hill, it remained open land until the 20th century, when it was sold for development. Today, with its golf course and luxurious mansions, it's become one of the most exclusive private and gated estates and home to many celebrities. In summary, then, in thinking about how humans have thought about the rest of nature, we started at the large scale with a synoptic overview using images. We then looked at 2 small-scale examples with Fordlandia and the Diggers, which illustrate different ideas about humans have thought about the rest of nature. The aim has been to present key ideas in ways which are hopefully accessible and engaging to students, and I'd welcome your thoughts on that. So, going back to my aims, I've suggested we need a curriculum where the other than human players, the climate, the land, plants and animals, are more than just the passive backdrop to the activities of humans. I also argue that embedding environmental perspectives into the curriculum means keeping a clear focus on the future. History is not dead and gone. It's part of the continuum from past into present into future. As we've become more aware of the environmental crises facing the planet, legislation has started being passed in a number of countries, recognising rivers, national parks, glaciers, forests and mountains as legal persons. This means they're entitled to representation and have a voice, much like a minor has when represented by a parent or guardian. However, while we need to attend to other agents beyond humans, we also need to acknowledge the dominant role that humans have played in the history of the world. Chakrabarty describes this as enlightened anthropocentrism. I want to end my presentation with a vignette from Iceland. Challenging human exceptionalism, I want to give the last word to a different historical actor. The glacier, Hawkey, also known as Hawkey, was declared dead in 2014, the result of changing climate. In August 2019, a plaque was installed. It's a letter written to the future, which reads, Hawkey is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. At the end of the plaque, there's the global atmospheric carbon dioxide reading for that moment, 450 parts per million. And today it's around 420. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. It's quite a sobering place to end, isn't it? But that's appropriate, I think. It's very appropriate. Super. Thank you.